Isn't that discrimination? Discrimination happens when one group is treated differently from another. Segregation happens when one group is kept separate from another group. Both of these happen when there is prejudice or intolerance. You will often hear these words when people talk about the way African Americans have been treated in our country. We shall overcome. The Jim Crow laws that discriminated against African Americans might still exist today if it wasn't for the hard work of people in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. There had always been resistance to the discrimination that blacks faced, but during that time people joined together, organized, and protested more than ever before. New laws were passed, other laws were declared unconstitutional, and things started to change in people's everyday lives. The people who changed things, civil rights movers and shakers. The civil rights movement was made up of many well-known people as well as political groups and ordinary citizens. They stood up to intimidation, violence, and threat of arrest. Even kids got involved. Martin Luther King Jr. helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. He delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. Malcolm X promoted black independence, self-defense, and human rights. He often disagreed with the nonviolent methods of King. Medgar Evers was a civil rights activist who investigated cases for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, or NAACP, and helped James Meredith integrate the University of Mississippi. The Little Rock Nine integrated their all-white high school in 1957. A third grader named Linda Brown helped change the laws about school segregation. Change starts with forcing people to pay attention. Activists used a variety of strategies to end racial discrimination. Like Martin Luther King Jr., many activists chose to use peaceful or nonviolent methods to call attention to the problem and pressure the government to change. Other people, like Malcolm X, thought civil rights would have to be gained through any means necessary, even violence. Both approaches influenced the civil rights movement by calling attention to the discrimination African Americans faced on a daily basis. Marches involved large groups of protesters taking to the streets with signs, banners, songs, and chants. Sit-ins were a way to integrate, bring races together, a business or public area. African Americans would sit at whites-only areas and wait to be served. Boycotts called for consumers to avoid a product or service that discriminated against African Americans, and court cases challenged unfair laws. Change in the White House. It took the work of all three branches to protect the civil rights of African Americans and other minority groups in the United States. As the leader of the nation in the executive branch, the president holds an important role in bringing about change. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy asked for legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments, as well as greater protection for the right to vote. He was assassinated that same year, but the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, helped push the bill through Congress. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law. Both men used their power and influence to enforce major political and social change. Change in the laws. Other changes came about when new laws were passed through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, and national origin. This includes discrimination in the workplace, public places, schools, and in voting. The 24th Amendment ended the practice of poll taxes in 1964. States and local governments could no longer charge citizens for the right to vote. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prevents any restriction on the right to vote. This included poll tests and voter intimidation. It followed through on the promise of the 15th Amendment. Change in the courts. Many changes came when the Jim Crow laws that limited the freedoms and rights of African Americans were challenged in the courts. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Bailey v. Patterson. In 1962, the Supreme Court decided it was unconstitutional for transportation facilities like bus and train stations to be racially segregated. And Loving v. Virginia. In 1967, the Supreme Court decided that any state law that prohibits interracial marriage is unconstitutional. Did anyone oppose the civil rights movement? Yes. There were many different groups that fought the changes brought on by the civil rights movement. In politics, a group called the Dixiecrats worked to keep racial segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South. Many Southern towns had white citizen councils that also fought to keep segregation by creating all-white schools and pushing blacks' civil rights out of the jobs. The most well-known group was the Ku Klux Klan, which met secretly and was responsible for acts of violence and terrorism against African Americans and white people who supported the fight for civil rights. These groups and others made even speaking out a very dangerous activity. Here's what you need to do to make sure you finish today. Number 1, take the quiz. You know the deal. This time there are 4 questions and 8 points total. 1 point just for answering the question, 2 points for getting it right, 0 points for not getting it done on time. Test questions come from the quizzes. They're open book, open note, and open internet. Go back and listen to the video to find answers. And I will tell you right now, there is no excuse to get less than 100% on this part of your lesson. Complete the review activities. Remember, they are checked for completion. Short answer test questions come directly from the review activities. Answers are provided on the following slides, along with guidance and instruction to find the correct answers. As I've talked about many times, you are not just copying down the answers I give you, you are listening to the way I find those answers and using it to complete the rest of the sheet. Go ahead and get to work, and you know exactly what you are supposed to be doing. Make sure you complete all assignments. First activity we're going to do is the vocabulary. We're going to match the word with the definition. Our terms are activist, segregation, nonviolent discrimination, integration, and prejudice. Let's start with activist. We're going to look through our definitions, and I'll tell you right now that the definition of activist is C, people who protest to call attention to a cause like civil rights. Segregation, we should already know this one. It's keeping things or people separate. The last one, you have already experienced the words nonviolent, discrimination, integration, and then the toughest one is going to be the difference between discrimination and prejudice. So go ahead and work through that one. Next one, name that protest. This activity will be on your test. 2 of these examples will be on your test, and you can already see that on your study guide. I walked to my summer job with my brother 6 days a week. Last summer we rode the bus and it took us 15 minutes. Now we walk 5 miles each way. It takes over an hour, but it's important for us to send a message. The bus company needs to know that we will not support segregated seating and discrimination. So this is one where they see a problem and they're going to say, we're not going to use that service. And if we go back to the mix, and we can see that that is an example of a boycott. Number 8, it was scary, but we sat down at the lunch counter and waited to be served. It wasn't fair that this diner refused to serve blacks, and we decided to sit at that counter until they did serve us. We didn't make a scene, we didn't yell, we didn't break stuff. We just sat there and waited. Angry people came up and hit us, yelled in our faces, and even dumped a milkshake on my friend's head. But we stayed. After 3 straight days, the diner finally decided to serve us. So what they did is they went and they just sat at the counter and waited to be served. That is a perfect example of a sit-in. And then our last activity on the front is alphabet soup. The civil rights movement was made up of many different groups and organizations. Most of them were known by their acronyms. Fill in the blanks using the word bank to discover what these letters mean. SNCC, we also call that one SNCC. So we're going to look for one that starts with an S, and I think the only one that starts with an S is Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Then we have CORE, Congress on Blank Equality. Well, let's look at which one would have an R, and that would be racial. I would like you to work through the remaining 3. They're pretty easy. All you have to do is match up the correct word. And our next slide. Who am I? There are many people involved with the civil rights movement. Read each hint and choose the correct person from the list. Let's start with the easiest one that everyone should be able to figure out right away. I started the Montgomery bus boycott when I refused to give up my seat to a white man who got on the bus. I was a secretary of the local NAACP. Who am I? It's your girl Rosa Parks. Another one with that may be a little challenging. I'm going to talk about the guy who was president at the time. As President of the United States, I signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Civil Rights Act of 1968 into law. Who am I? Well, he is the president at this time. It is Lyndon Baines Johnson. So this one, I am going to be changing one of the people and one of the situations, but I do want to let you know this one will be on the test. And the last one, problems and solutions. Remember those what-if statements early in the lesson? They weren't made up. The Supreme Court made decisions that changed the way laws treated African Americans. Connect the story, problem, and how the court solved it. The first one is done for you. I didn't even have to do this one. So you're going to connect the last 2 stories, the one about a group of African Americans trying to check into a hotel in Atlanta, Georgia, and African Americans being forced to sit and stand in different areas of public transportation. I want you to look at those 2. You have to connect it to the correct problem and the correct Supreme Court solution. So like I said, 2 of the activities on this review sheet are on your test. I tried to point them out for you. Please do your best on them because they will help you on your test next Monday. Thank you, and go ahead and get started. Let me know if you have any questions.